It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, just a casual Sunday afternoon. But when I opened the door, his eyes lingered a second too long, and his words sent a chill through me. "Aunt Sarah, have you ever felt stuck?" I didn't know what he meant at first, but as the conversation unfolded, I realized this wasn't just about life, it was about us. And I wasn't ready for what came next. Life had always been simple, or at least, that's what I thought. As a single woman in my early 40s, I had settled into a comfortable routine, balancing my work, my hobbies, and the occasional family gathering. Sundays were usually my favorite, a quiet time to reflect, catch up on chores, or indulge in a good book. But that one Sunday changed everything. It started with a knock at the door. My nephew, Donald, had always been a regular visitor, dropping by to chat, borrow a book, or enjoy a meal. At 22, he was smart, charming, and ambitious, but he carried an air of restlessness, as though he was always searching for something more. I had practically helped raise him after my sister's divorce, and over the years, we had developed a close bond. He was more like a son to me than a nephew. That day, though, something was different. When I opened the door, Donald greeted me with his usual smile, but there was something behind it, an unease I couldn't quite place. "Hey, Aunt Sarah," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "How's it going?" "Fine," I replied, shutting the door behind him. "You?" He shrugged, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "Just had a lot on my mind lately," he said. "Thought I'd stop by and see you." Donald had always been the type to keep things bottled up, but eventually, he'd let me in, usually after a cup of tea and a few minutes of small talk. I didn't push him. Instead, I invited him to the living room, where we settled into our usual spots. I offered him tea, which he declined, opting instead to flick through the channels on the TV. We ended up watching an old movie, laughing at the cheesy dialogue and exaggerated action scenes. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to notice little things, the way his knee edged closer to mine, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift I couldn't ignore. Donald had always been affectionate, but this felt different. And as the evening went on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had changed between us. I just didn't know what or why. Over the next few days, Donald's visits became more frequent. He showed up unannounced, often without any particular reason, and lingered longer than usual. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just going through a phase, perhaps seeking comfort or guidance. But the way he acted around me, the way he looked at me, was different now. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. One evening, as we sat on the porch, he asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Aunt Sarah," he began, his voice softer than usual, "do you ever feel stuck?" "Stuck?" I repeated, unsure of what he meant. "Yeah," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Like your life isn't what it should be. Like you're just going through the motions." I chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Donald, everyone feels that way sometimes. Life isn't perfect, you know. We just have to make the best of it." He didn't laugh. Instead, he turned his head to look at me, his expression serious. "But what if you don't have to? What if there's someone who gets it, someone who sees you for who you really are?" His words sent a chill through me. I froze, gripping the edge of my chair as his gaze lingered on mine. The way he said it, the way he looked at me, it wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. And for the first time, I realized that the tension I had been brushing off wasn't just in my head. "Donald," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm, "I don't know what you're trying to say, but..." "I'm just saying," he interrupted, leaning closer, "you don't have to feel alone. I understand you. More than anyone else does." The air between us felt heavy, suffocating. I stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. "It's getting late," I said, forcing a smile. "We should call it a night." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as though he wanted to say more. But then he nodded, his lips curving into a faint, almost sad smile. "Yeah. Okay." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as his words replayed in my mind. "I understand you. More than anyone else does." What had he meant by that? Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? The next morning, I told myself I was overthinking it. Donald had always been close to me. Maybe he was just going through a rough patch, searching for a connection. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. And then it happened again. Donald showed up that evening, unannounced as usual. This time, he didn't bother with small talk. He sat across from me in the living room, his hands fidgeting in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I need to say something," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay," I said hesitantly. "What is it?" He looked up, and the intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About how things feel when I'm around you. And I think I care about you in a way I shouldn't." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, searching for a way to respond, but all I could do was stare at him, stunned. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I can't help how I feel. I've tried to ignore it, to push it down, but I can't. Being around you, it's like nothing else matters." "Stop," I said sharply, finding my voice. "Donald, this is crossing a line. You can't." "I know," he said, standing abruptly, his hands trembling. "I know it's wrong, but I needed you to know. I couldn't keep it inside anymore." I stood, putting the couch between us. "Donald, you need to leave. Now." His face crumpled, a mix of regret and desperation flashing in his eyes. But he nodded, his shoulders slumping as he headed for the door. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. The uneasy feeling in my stomach had grown into something much darker. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if it could ever be fixed. After that night, I thought things would settle down, that the lines I had drawn would be enough to put this behind us. But I was wrong. Donald didn't stop coming by, and though he never brought up what he had said, the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every visit felt like a test, as though he was waiting for me to acknowledge the unspoken truth hanging in the air. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard the now familiar knock at the door. My stomach twisted, but I opened it, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. Donald stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to check on you," he said softly. "Make sure you're okay." I hesitated but stepped aside to let him in. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice clipped. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I wanted to," he said, his gaze lingering on me as he sat down on the couch. "I've been thinking about what I said, and I'm sorry if it upset you. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. "Donald, we've been over this. Whatever you think you're feeling, it's not real. It's just." "It is real," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I know it's wrong, but that doesn't make it any less real. And I don't think you can deny it, either." My heart raced as he stood, closing the distance between us. I stepped back instinctively, my mind screaming for me to stop this before it went any further. "Donald, this has to end," I said, my voice trembling. "You're confused. You're lonely, and you're looking for something that isn't there." "It's not just loneliness," he insisted, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's you. It's always been you." I shook my head, backing into the kitchen as he followed. "You don't know what you're saying," I said, my voice rising. "You're young, and you're mistaking gratitude or admiration for something else. But this isn't love." "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You don't know what's in my head. You don't know how I feel when I'm around you." "I know enough to know this is wrong," I snapped, slamming the dishcloth I was holding onto the counter. "You're my nephew, Donald. My family. And this is crossing a line I can't let you cross." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Then, quietly, he said, "Then why do you look at me like that?" The question caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. "What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice barely audible. "I see it," he said, stepping closer again. The way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. Like you're fighting something, too. That's enough, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know what you think you've seen, but you're wrong. And this conversation is over. I turned to leave the room, desperate to put space between us, but his voice stopped me in my tracks. You don't have to pretend, he said softly. Not with me. I spun around, anger boiling over. Pretend? Pretend what, Donald? That this doesn't disgust me? That it doesn't make me sick to my stomach to think of what you're implying? He flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said, his voice steady despite the tears welling in his eyes. I needed to say it. Even if you hate me for it. I don't hate you, I said, my voice cracking. But I can't do this. I won't do this. You need to leave, Donald. And you need to get some help. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't need help, he muttered. I need you. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stood there, frozen, as he turned and walked toward the door. I'm sorry, he said before leaving. I don't know how to stop. When the door closed behind him, I collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking with a mixture of anger, fear, and guilt. I wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that he would take my words to heart and move on. But deep down, I knew better. The feelings he had confessed weren't going to disappear overnight. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I had done enough to stop him or if I had only made things worse. The days that followed were unbearable. Donald kept his distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Every knock at the door, every message on my phone sent my heart racing. I wanted to believe that our last conversation had been enough, that he'd finally understood the boundaries I'd set. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before he came back. And then, one evening, it happened. I was sitting on the couch, lost in a book, when I heard the familiar knock at the door. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something told me I couldn't avoid this forever. I stood, my hands trembling as I walked to the door. When I opened it, Donald was standing there, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. He held a small bag in his hand, which he extended toward me. What's this? I asked, my voice wary. Just, something I thought you'd like, he said, his voice low. To say I'm sorry. I hesitated but took the bag, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the living room, his movements slow, as if he were unsure of his place. I set the bag on the coffee table without opening it and crossed my arms. Donald, I began, keeping my tone firm, we've talked about this. You shouldn't be here. I know, he said, turning to face me. But I can't just leave things like this. I can't pretend that nothing happened. You have to, I replied. For both of our sakes. What you're feeling, it's not right, and it's not something we can talk about anymore. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back. It's not just a feeling, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. It's real. And I know you feel it, too. Stop, I said sharply. You don't know anything about what I feel. Don't I? He asked, his tone challenging. If you really didn't feel anything, you wouldn't have let me in. You wouldn't be standing here right now, listening to me. I let you in because I care about you, I said, my voice trembling. Because you're my nephew, and I want to help you. But this has to stop. He shook his head, his frustration evident. You keep saying that, but you don't mean it. I see the way you look at me, the way you hesitate when I'm close to you. You're scared, Aunt Sarah. Scared of what this means. I'm scared because you're not thinking clearly, I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. You're confusing your feelings, and you're putting us both in an impossible situation. It's not confusion, he said, his voice rising. And you know it. Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. My breath caught as he unfolded it and held it out to me. This, he said, his voice shaking, proves I'm not imagining things. I took the paper with trembling hands, my heart sinking as I recognized it immediately. It was a letter I had written months ago, a journal entry, never meant for anyone's eyes but my own. In it, I had poured out my deepest feelings of loneliness, my yearning for connection, my frustration with the emptiness I felt. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and humiliation. "I found it," he admitted, his tone defensive. "I wasn't snooping. It was in the drawer by the couch. I wasn't even looking for it, but when I saw it, I couldn't stop reading." "You had no right," I said, clutching the paper to my chest. "That was private, Donald. It wasn't meant for anyone else." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But it made me realize I'm not crazy. The way I feel about you, it's not one-sided. You feel it, too. You've just been too afraid to admit it." The room seemed to spin as his words sank in. My vision blurred with tears, and I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of emotions clouding my thoughts. "Donald, listen to me," I said, my voice trembling. "What you read, it wasn't about you. It wasn't about us. It was about me, about things I've been struggling with. And you had no right to use it against me." "I'm not using it against you," he said, his tone softening. "I just needed you to see that I'm not making this up. That there's something real between us." "There's nothing real between us," I said, my voice breaking. "You're my nephew, Donald. My family. And that's all we'll ever be." His face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue again. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to deal with it." "I know," I said, my tears spilling over. "But you need to let this go. For both of us." He nodded again, wiping his eyes as he turned to leave. "I'll try," he said. "I promise." As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, clutching the letter in my hands. My heart ached with a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long road to healing for both of us. The silence in the days that followed was deafening. Donald stopped coming by, and his texts grew sparse, limited to polite inquiries about how I was doing. At first, I was relieved, grateful for the space to collect my thoughts and let the emotional storm settle. But the distance only seemed to magnify the weight of what had happened. The words he had spoken, the emotions he had revealed, hung in the air like a shadow I couldn't escape. I told myself I had done the right thing by confronting him, by setting clear boundaries. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my thoughts refused to rest, I wondered if I could have handled it differently. Had I been too harsh? Too quick to push him away? Or had I simply done what was necessary to protect us both? One evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Donald. "Can we talk?" My chest tightened. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to maintain the distance I had fought so hard to establish. But another part of me, a softer, more vulnerable part, felt compelled to respond. I didn't want to leave things unresolved, not after everything we had been through. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," I typed back, my hands trembling. "We both need time." His reply came almost instantly. "I understand. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I set the phone down, my throat tightening. His apology felt sincere, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. It didn't make the situation any less complicated or the emotions any less raw. As the weeks went by, Donald's messages became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped altogether. I tried to convince myself that this was a good thing, that he was finally moving on, finding a way to process his feelings without involving me. But the absence of his presence, his voice, left an ache I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, I ran into my sister at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries, chatting about the weather and family updates, but I could feel her eyes studying me, searching for something I wasn't ready to share. "Donald hasn't been himself lately," she said casually, her tone light but probing. "He's been quieter than usual. Is everything okay between you two?" I forced a smile, avoiding her gaze. "He's probably just busy," I said. "You know how he gets when he's got a lot on his plate." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, but the conversation left me shaken. I couldn't help but wonder if she suspected something, if she had noticed the strain in our relationship. The thought of her finding out the truth was unbearable. As the weeks turned into months, life slowly began to settle back into a semblance of normalcy. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office and filling my weekends with errands and hobbies. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the lingering sense of loss. I missed the way things had been before the lines blurred, before the feelings were spoken aloud, before everything fell apart. And yet, I knew there was no going back. The bond we once shared had been irreparably changed, and no amount of time or effort could erase the memories of what had transpired. All I could do was move forward, one day at a time. One evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from Donald. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. "I've been talking to someone," it read. "A therapist. I just wanted you to know that I'm working on it. On myself." Tears welled in my eyes as I stared at the message, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over me. I wanted to reply, to offer words of encouragement, but I knew it wasn't my place. This was his journey, and he needed to walk it on his own. "I'm glad to hear that," I replied simply. "Take care of yourself, Donald." His response was immediate. "You too. Thank you for everything." As I set the phone down, a sense of closure began to settle over me. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the pain or the memories. But it was a start, a small step toward healing for both of us. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The mistakes I had made, the boundaries I had set, the lessons I had learned. It wasn't easy, but I was slowly beginning to forgive myself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not handling things perfectly, for being human. And as for Donald, I could only hope that he, too, would find peace in time. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again, or at least as normal as it could. Donald's absence became a quiet constant, a reminder of the boundaries I had fought so hard to enforce. I focused on my own healing, spending time with friends, taking on new hobbies, and allowing myself to reclaim the space that had been overshadowed by the tension of the past. I hadn't heard from Donald since his message about seeing a therapist, and while a part of me missed him, I knew the distance was necessary. It gave us both room to breathe, to process, to heal in our own ways. Still, there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when his words echoed in my mind. The confession, the vulnerability, the way he had looked at me as if I were the only person in the world who understood him. It had been overwhelming, heartbreaking even, but it had also forced me to confront parts of myself I hadn't wanted to see. For years, I had buried my own feelings of loneliness, pushing aside the longing for connection and intimacy in favor of routine and practicality. Donald's words had exposed a crack in the wall I had so carefully built, and though it had been painful, it also taught me something valuable. Ignoring your own needs doesn't make them disappear. But there was another lesson, too, a harder, more sobering one. Boundaries matter. No matter how much we care about someone, no matter how deep the bond or strong the connection, there are lines that should never be crossed. I had seen what happens when those lines blur, when emotions take over and reason falters. And while I couldn't undo the past, I could learn from it. I could ensure it never happened again. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, I thought about the future, not just mine, but Donald's too. I hoped he was finding his way, that the therapy was helping him untangle the emotions that had caused so much turmoil. I hoped he was rediscovering himself, learning to build relationships that were healthy and fulfilling. And I hoped, most of all, that he would find peace. As for me, I was beginning to find mine. Slowly but surely, I was learning to forgive myself not just for what had happened, but for the years of self-neglect that had led to it. I was learning to prioritize my own well-being, to embrace my own needs and desires without guilt or shame. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. The final step came in the form of a letter, a simple note from Donald that arrived one crisp autumn morning. In it, he thanked me for being there for him, for setting boundaries, for encouraging him to seek help. He told me he was doing better, that he had made peace with his feelings and was focusing on his own growth. The letter ended with a simple but powerful statement: "I'll always care about you, Aunt Sarah, but I understand now that love means respect, and respect means letting go." Tears streamed down my face as I read those words, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over me. It was the closure I hadn't realized I needed, the confirmation that we had both found our way through the chaos and emerged stronger on the other side. As I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The past would always be a part of me, a chapter in my story that couldn't be erased. But it didn't have to define me. It didn't have to hold me back. Looking out at the golden leaves falling from the trees, I took a deep breath and smiled. Life was messy, complicated, and often unpredictable. But it was also beautiful, full of growth and redemption. And as I sat there, surrounded by the quiet promise of a new season, I knew that I was ready to embrace it all. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Could boundaries and healing truly mend such a complicated situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of human relationships. Trust me, the next one will leave you just as speechless. See you in the next chapter.